Today we're talking about biogenesis and evil Spock. And that will probably make sense as we go on. But I want to ask the question, where does the eyeball come from? You know, last week we've been doing this series called Can You Have a Brain and Be a Christian? So last week we talked about cosmology and Big Bang and did the universe have a beginning and did everything come from nothing? So if you didn't get a chance to see that, you can go back and check it out. But today we're going to talk about biology. We're going to talk about where did the eyeball come from. You know, there's a phrase, from the goo to the zoo to you. There's this idea that there was a primordial soup, and out of the primordial soup came single-cell life form, and out of that single cell came complex bacteria and so forth. And that eventually, over billions of years, here you are. And I'm actually not here to deny that. You're not going to hear me say that didn't happen today. But we are going to talk about those issues. And we're going to talk about, is it realistic to believe in God, to be a theist in light of science? And so what we're doing today is we're peeling back the onion. I've told you before that a lot of the stuff I present, and today is no exception, the things I'll present today, an atheist would have an answer for. And then the theist will have an answer to the atheist. And then the atheist will have an answer to the theist. And there's no way in a sermon that we can actually tackle the entire argument. There's no way to do that unless we bring in a debate and give them each an hour, 2 hours. And even then, that doesn't quite cut the mustard. And so what I'm going to do today is just lay out the basic layer, the top layer on biology. Now, the worst thing a public speaker can do is get up in front of people and apologize right away. You've all seen it. They get up and say, well, guys, I'm sorry. I'm just not a very good public speaker. This makes me really nervous. And they start unbuttoning their shirt in front of everybody. And I've heard terrible stories. But the worst thing you can do is get up and say, I heard a story in my public speaking class of a guy who, while he was teaching, would unbutton his shirt all the way to the bottom and then button it all the way back up to the top. And then unbutton it all the way to the bottom. He was so nervous and he had no idea he was doing it. And so I wore an undershirt today just in case. But I'm going to say right away, biology is not my field. I felt much more comfortable talking about cosmology, and I feel like I can go deeper into the onion on that issue. But I am on a spiritual journey just like the rest of you. I'm on an intellectual journey just like the rest of you, trying to figure all this out. And so I'm going to share with you where I'm at today. It's that simple. Now, everything I'm going to say, I'm not even saying that what I teach today is certain science. There's a lot of questions. Just like last week in cosmology. If they come up with what they call the quantum theory of gravity, you may have heard it referred to as the theory of everything. Nobody's done that yet. If that should happen, a lot of the stuff that I taught last week could just explode. I mean, it would be gone. And yet that hasn't happened, so we can only go with what we know now. And that's what I'm doing where biology is concerned, is I'm going to share with you where I'm at now, with the caveat, just like I shared last week, that my faith does not rise or fall on biology. My faith does not rise on or fall on what happened to the dinosaurs and did they become fossil fuels for our benefit and what was a pterodactyl. And my faith falls on a resurrected dead man about 1984 years ago, about 2,000 years ago. I believe a dead man came back to life, and he happened to be the same dead man that went around teaching everybody he was God's son. He was the Messiah of God. He was God in the flesh. That's what I hang my hat on. This is supplementary stuff. This is the fringe stuff as far as I'm concerned. I could be completely wrong with the stuff I'm about to present to you, and it would not affect my Christianity. Because I believe being a Christianity is to being a follower of that resurrected man. And I can be a follower of the resurrected man and be wrong about origins. And so there's a bunch of different ideas out there on how biology happened, how the world came to be. And there's what they call young earth creationism, okay? This is the idea that and it depends on who you talk to. It could have been 6,000 years ago, it could have been 12,000 years ago, somewhere in that range. God said, let there be whales, and there were whales, and whales came in perfect whale form. God said, let there be wolves, and let there be elephants, and there they were, okay? So it's a rapid creation event, and they'll say that it happened over 6 or 7 days. Okay, bam, literal 24-hour periods. So this is one view. Now, another view would be what's called progressive creationism. It's this idea that the universe really is about 13.8 billion years old, like the astronomy seems to indicate, that the rings in the tree, when you cut it down, indicate old trees, that this is an ancient universe, and yet God did progressive miracles throughout the history of the world, so that biology would become more complex. So it kind of lines up with the idea that yes, there were ages, yes, there were simpler times when it comes to biology that became gradually more complex, but it's this idea that God inserted something during those time periods. And so when you're addressed with something like the Cambrian explosion, in the Cambrian explosion you've got very, very, very simple life forms, and then all of a sudden you've got a megaplex of really advanced invertebrates. I mean, it just, bam, it just happened. So the progressive creationist says that was a special act of creation. Now, did that happen how we would call genetically, through breeding? It's not real clear. And some progressive creationists will say one way, some will say the other. But it's the idea that it is old, but yet God kept stepping in. Okay? Then you've got theistic evolution. Theistic evolution is that God didn't necessarily step in, that it's very old, and it was a very slow process. That it kind of happened just like a materialistic Darwinist would say, is there were single-cell organisms, and then mutations occurred, and natural selection took hold. And yet, from the beginning, God designed those laws for this result, that you and I would be sitting in this theater today. And so it's this idea that, yes, it happened just like the materialists would say, and yet God was the one who designed the system. Now, do you see that these three views do not disqualify you one way or the other, regardless of which of the three you choose? And there are others. There's the gap theory view. There's other views that kind of are mixes of these views. But do you see that none of these disqualify you from following the resurrected dead man? None of them disqualify you from following Jesus. You might be wrong about Genesis 1. You might be wrong about some peripherals. But it doesn't mean that you can't be resurrected internally, start over in life, be born again, and chase after God and love people. Your views on these things are peripheral, in my opinion. Now, there's a fourth view, and in my opinion, it is not connectable with Christianity. It is literally anti-theist. It's atheist. It's an atheist view, and I'm calling it neo-Darwinian materialistic evolution. It's very hard to, if you just say evolution, that means 1,000 things to 1,000 people. So I'm trying to be as specific as possible. Now, this is called a blobfish. This is a real creature. A lot of people call it the ugliest creature on earth. I promise my heart is not to insult anybody by putting that picture up there. I'm not saying if you're a Darwinist or materialist that you're a blobfish. That's not, because I know the other pictures were beautiful. The reason I shared this picture is because, in my opinion, if purely natural processes did mutate anything that would become anything, this is the kind of picture I imagine. And if the blobfish was the only organism on Earth, then I'd have to look really hard and long and say, well, maybe something just random happened. You can look at that fish and say it. But it's hard to do in the face of the turtle or the horse. Or are these cheetahs or leopards? I don't know. Which are they? Cheetahs. That's what I said, cheetahs. It's hard to do that. Antony Flew was maybe the world's most famous atheist for years. He debated all the Christian apologists many, many times. His debates with William Lane Craig are legendary. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people would show up to hear this guy's take on atheism. And in his later years, Antony Flew became a Christian, and he wrote this book. It's called There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And in his book, he talks about the old Socratic axiom. So Socrates said, follow the argument where it leads. This is one of the hardest things you'll ever do in your life, is to approach something like this and look at it purely for what it is, outside of your own biases. It's very, very hard to give an honest look at atheism if you've been raised as a theist your entire life. And likewise, it's very, very hard to give an honest look to theism if you've been raised an atheist. I may have reversed those. But you see what I'm saying. Depending on your culture, depending on how you've been raised, it's very, very difficult to examine evidence honestly and follow the argument where it leads, instead of inserting your own biases into it. And that was Antony Flew's view. He really wanted to do that. And so he started examining the evidence. And he finally fell on what they call the infinite monkey theorem. Anybody familiar with the infinite monkey theorem? It's a concept, it's an idea, and they'll say that if you had an infinite amount of monkeys banging on an infinite amount of typewriters for an infinite amount of time, eventually one monkey will write the completed works of Shakespeare. So it's this idea that random processes, purely random processes, over eons of time, long, long lengths of time, can accomplish anything. Well, some students at the University of Plymouth decided one day, some students and their advisor and a few of the scientists there decided that they were going to kind of give this thing a little test. And so they took 7 monkeys and they put them in a room and they put them in a room with a keyboard. That's only 5 monkeys, I realize that. So they had a leg up on this picture. And they put them in a room with a keyboard and let them bang away just to see what does it, will they put it together a coherent word? Will there be a sentence that forms? How long will it take them to randomly type out anything that makes sense? And the head of the project, his name was Michael Phillips, he said this. He said, the lead male got a stone and started bashing it. Another thing they were interested in was defecating and urinating all over the keyboard. They pressed a lot of S's. Obviously, English isn't their first language. Apparently, in the process of weeks, at the beginning they were interested in the keyboard. They'd go to the bathroom on it. They'd bang it with rocks. They'd try to pull it off the wall. And after weeks of monkeys having access to a keyboard, they completed 5 pages of typed text. So they weren't super interested in the keyboard, and when they did, and for whatever reason, it was page after page filled with S's. So I don't know what it was about their paws or their hands or whatever you call them or how they touched the keyboard, but apparently there was a predominant amount of S's over any other, and they didn't form a single coherent word. Because you understand that to even use the word A, right? If you're going to pull out the word A, you have to have 3 characters in a row. You have to have a space and an A and a space. And apparently not even that happened. There might have been some words contained in words, so like A was probably contained somewhere in there, or T-O might have been in there, but for it to be a coherent word, you had to have the spaces on the end. Apparently that never happened even once. Now, Shakespeare's complete works. Let's talk about the odds of that ever happening through purely random processes, and let's take his most famous sonnet that begins with, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" It says, "Thou art more lovely and more temperate." And man, Shakespeare was the man. You read it, and he was a romantic. He was good at his stuff. But this is Sonnet 18. It's 14 lines long. Okay, so it's, if you on a type page, it's about that long. Now, what does it take for a random process to produce this sonnet? Let's take the first word, shall. S-H-A-L-L. 5 letters long, and then you need a space at the end. So 6 letters. But I may have even done the calculations for the 5 letters. I did. So let's pretend you've got a keyboard with 30 keys on it. You've got the alphabet, 26 characters, and we'll give you 4 characters, a comma, a period, something else. Just a real keyboard would have far more keys on it, but let's just call it 30 for ease, for simplicity. That means in order to type the word shall through random process, you're picking a random key, right? If you pick a wrong key, you have to start over from the beginning. To do that, the math goes like this. You would need 1 in 30 times 30 times 30 times 30 times 30. That's the odds of accidentally typing the word shall on a keyboard. That's 1 in 24,300,000. That's the odds of writing the word shall. Then you have to multiply that times 30 to get the space after shall. Then you have to multiply it by 30 again to get the I that comes after shall in shall I compare thee to a summer's day. And the interesting thing is, in order to write the whole sonnet, 14 lines, we're just talking about 14 lines of text that are the same length as this one, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, it turns into this crazy number, 1 in 10 to the 690th power. That's a 10 with 690 zeros after it. I plugged this into an online scientific calculator because I was going to do a further calculation because I was going to try to impress you guys with my math skills. Here's what the online scientific calculator came up with. Infinity. You see that? You can kind of see it on the screen. It's a little blurry, but it says 10 to the 690th power is roughly equivalent to infinity. So that's the odds of writing one sonnet, is 1 in 10 to the 690th power. And this is the stuff that Antony Flew was throwing through his head when he became a theist. Now, to try to give you there's no way we can possibly grasp such a number. But just in order to do it, I've tried to search online to find out how many atoms are there in the universe. And we know that there's so many atoms in the head of a pin that it's just uncalculable. Didn't even say that word, uncalculatable. So I looked up how many atoms in the universe, and here's the numbers you get. You get somewhere in the realm of 10 to the 78th to 10 to the 82nd power. So in all the universe, all the stars, all the clouds, all the meteoroids, all of it, that's how many atoms. And we can't even picture how many atoms are in a single cell. Now I was reading a forum online, and they were talking about how many atoms are in the universe, and this guy wrote these words. He said, when I was 11, I wondered about space and asked the same question. The answer I was given was about 10 to the 78th power. So the person who answered 10 to the 80th power above is in the same league. Here's my response to that. No, he is not. 10 to the 80th power compared to 10 to the 78th power is 100 times more. So you take one universe, and let's pretend the whole universe has 10 to the 78th in it. If it becomes 10 to the 79th, now you have 10 universes. If it becomes 10 to the 80th, now you have 100 universes. 10 to the 81st, 1,000 universes. What kind of number is 10 to the 690th power? It's just, it's ridiculous. And we're only talking about one sonnet. So what would it take for monkeys to bang out Shakespeare's complete works? I mean, if the only amount of time that would work would be infinity. And as we talked about last week, that's not what we have to work with. The universe had a beginning. There are no actual infinites. There are not an actually infinite amount of monkeys. There are not an actually infinite amount of keyboards. And there is not an actually infinite amount of time. It doesn't exist. So Antony Flew, in thinking about all these numbers and what are the odds of this kind of information, started looking at DNA and RNA studies. And this is where I get lost. Man, I read some of this stuff and I have to read it 8 times just to get an idea of what they're talking about. But my understanding is that one single cell in a living organism, that the DNA coded in that cell is equivalent to about 14 sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So the DNA coded into one single living cell is 14 sets, not just 14 books, but 14 sets of what you see in front of you. Now compare that to our sonnet, that's 1 in 10 to the 690th power, and DNA is coded precisely. It's a language. It's the language of creation. What are the odds? Even given the idea that amino acids and proteins could bang against each other in the right atmosphere with the right energy applied and just that something could happen, what are the odds that this kind of information could be produced randomly? It's a hard pill to swallow. There's an old Simpsons skit, and we'll need sound for this, guys, that illustrates what we're talking about here.
This is 1,000 monkeys working at 1,000 typewriters. Soon, they'll have written the greatest novel known to man. Let's see. It was the best of times. It was the blurst of times. You stupid monkey! Oh, shut up.
Okay. I thought blurst of times was pretty funny myself. Apparently, only 2 people in the front row did as well. The odds of it happening, 0. The odds of it happening, it's just impossible. It'd be impossible with trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions. I mean, you could say trillions, a trillion times right here, right now, and not come close to the amount of time you'd have to need for a code like that to be processed somehow randomly. And so last week we talked about how the universe had a beginning. It's not infinite. Even if you give it to the scientists on a silver platter, which I have a tendency to do, it's 13.8 billion years old. 13.8 billion years is nothing where biogenesis is concerned, where the beginning of life is concerned, where that first single cell is concerned. And what most scientists will say is that the Earth itself is approximately 4.54 billion years old. They'll say that's about the time when the cloud coagulated, if that's the right word, and started to spin, and the moon became the moon, and the Earth was born about that long ago. But here's the problem. At the beginning, the Earth was in either a molten form or a gaseous form, and it was just hot gas, like a lot of you guys, and it could not sustain life for quite some time. So they'll say maybe by 3.8 billion years ago, maybe the Earth could possibly sustain life. So for those first 0.7 billion years, no life, no way. Then 3.8 billion years ago, now it becomes possible. But here's the real difficulty. They'll say about 3.4 billion years ago, we started to have complex bacteria on this planet. And I don't know where they come up with all this, and it seems to be a pretty general scientific consensus. It's not necessarily accurate. A lot of times when they're throwing around numbers in the billions, I want to think, how do you even know that? I mean, how is that even possible? But that's what they say. That's what the experts tend to say is 3.8 billion years ago, the Earth became life-sustaining. 3.4 billion years ago, we have this complex bacteria, which is way, way, way more completely different than a single-cell organism. So sometime in that 400 million years, there's a gap there of 400 million years, they'll say biogenesis occurred. The first life began. 400 million years. Now I want to compare that to a game you guys have probably heard of called Minute to Win It. You guys know Minute to Win It? Well, let's talk about the lottery for a second, and then we'll get back to that. They say the New York lottery, your odds are about 1 in 45 million of winning it. If you buy a ticket, your odds are 1 in 45 million of winning the lottery. So when we talk about that sonnet, that small amount of information, okay, the odds of that occurring in that period of time would be equivalent to the odds of winning the lottery 9 times 10 to the 45 times in a row. You have to buy that many lottery tickets and win every time for that sonnet to be created in a short period of time. Now again, I realize these are just numbers on a screen, that these numbers rely on other numbers that somebody came up with somewhere. But the point is, it's just astronomically ridiculous to think this could possibly happen. So when we talk about a 400 million year gap for not only biogenesis to occur, but for biogenesis to evolve into these advanced complex bacterial organisms, it's just impossible. It's just completely impossible. So when we talk about Minute to Win It, here's one of the games that they do. Need some sound.
Egg Tower. In this challenge, the contestant must use 4 paper towel rolls and 4 raw eggs to construct a tower. Improper alignment will result in almost certain collapse. Failure to complete this task in 60 seconds may result in elimination.
So, a difficult task to build a tower so long made out of the paper towel holders and eggs, right? But it can be done. Now, the kind of thing that we're talking about is if I sat 18 bazillion eggs out and 19 gajillion paper towel holders out, these are actual scientific numbers, and I said, okay, you need to make a tower out of these that wraps around the solar system 14 billion times without it falling, and you've got 0.2 microseconds to do it. Go. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about here. And here's the deal. Scientists know this. They recognize it. They recognize the absolute, I'm going to use the word, absurdity of biogenesis occurring in that short period of time. So they theorize. What do we do? And they've come up with what they call multiverse theories. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. And I'm not saying that multiverse doesn't exist. If you believe in multiverse, then all of a sudden you've still got to deal with some of the philosophical absence of infinites that we talked about last week. It could possibly be. It's going to be very, very hard to prove without a quantum theory of gravity. I realize I'm out there right now. But they theorize that that this isn't the only universe, that the only thing that makes sense is that there must be an infinite amount of universes out there, and we happen to exist in that one planet, in the infinite amount of universes that happen to spawn biogenesis in that short window that we've talked about. There's a branch of philosophy called modal realism, and the idea in modal realism, my understanding is that all worlds could conceivably exist and that they most probably do exist. So not only is Linda in the room with us today with her hand on her chin, but somewhere in some universe out there, because there's an infinite amount of universes, there's a universe where she's not in that chair, she's in the chair next to her. She doesn't have her hand on her chin in one universe, she has it right here. And in another universe, she has her hand right here, but she had her legs broken when they were a child and they're bowed out at the knees. And in another universe, she didn't even come to church because she hates Christians. There's all these universes out there. And this is where science is leading. It's this idea that there must be an infinite amount of universes, otherwise there's no possible way that complex organisms could have existed in that tiny, tiny little window there. There's other theories, alien theories, that aliens arrived on the backs of crystals, which happens to be the theory that Richard Dawkins espouses from what I've heard. He's the leading atheist of our time. In my opinion, just some kooky stuff. And there's an old episode of Star Trek called Mirror, Mirror. And you guys are probably familiar with Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy, who passed away recently. And in Mirror, Mirror, they enter a parallel universe. So it's one of those infinite amounts of universes out there. And when they go in, they encounter evil Spock. And the difference between evil Spock and good Spock is a goatee. Sulu, good Sulu, and bad Sulu. Bad Sulu has a scar. He's very scary. What do we call this? What are these shows? What's the type? Science fiction. It's what you have to embrace. If you're going to believe that something natural, random, and material brought about biogenesis. My opinion, it's where I'm at now. I'm open to being proven wrong about that, but the science seems to be pretty much a lockdown. John Lennox, the famous mathematician from Cambridge, said, "Nonsense remains nonsense even when talked about by world-famous scientists." He also said the irony is that atheism is a faith position and science itself cannot do without faith. See, here's the thing, is everybody puts their faith in something. If you're going to be a materialist nowadays, you pretty much must. I don't know of an alternative. You must put your faith in the multiverse. If you're going to be any kind of an honest viewer of science, if you're going to look at science and give it any kind of an honest view at all, really multiverse is your only option. Because it just could not have happened in the kind of time frame that we're talking about on this planet. Now, I'm not saying that this didn't happen. I'm not saying that. I'm relatively agnostic on this stuff. I'm really not clear on how stuff happened, how it went down. But I do know this. Paul wrote this a couple thousand years ago. He says, God has made it plain. Since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, so that people are without excuse. He's talking about people. He says, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, notice that word, images, made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. We see images all over the place that people have drawn that tell us how things went down. 2,000 years ago, Paul, long before Darwin, long before any of Darwin's theories, wrote that there would come a time that people would worship images of birds and men and reptiles rather than worship the Creator. I'm not saying that this didn't happen. I really am not sure how it went down. But I'm saying if you bank on this as the end-all, be-all of why you are here and the only thing that caused you, you're worshiping created things rather than the Creator. And in my opinion, that's not a very good place to be. I encourage you to look past that. The Scripture seems to indicate that you ought to be able to step outside and look around and see God. Now, I don't know who can and who can't, or why, who's the chosen and who's the unchosen, and all. I get pretty discombobulated on a lot of stuff. But I know Scripture teaches that if you seek the truth, you will find it. I'm convinced that if you will follow the argument where it leads, not where your biases want it to lead, and I have to confront that as a theist, as a Christian myself, but I'm convinced that if you go after truth, truth ends in theism, and truth ends in not only a God, but a God that revealed himself through a man, Jesus Christ. And if you're interested in pursuing that and learning more about that, we've got a boatload of videos on our website now for you to check out. So I encourage you, chase after truth. Just look for truth, and I believe you'll find it in Jesus.